Hello, so this is the beginning of my presentation, how to get departments to work together effectively. So the first question to ask is, why don't departments work together well right now? And the first thing to consider is the different perspectives that different departments automatically bring to a job. So for example, systems wants a stable environment, but product development wants something new. It's kind of like the conflict that you typically have between developers and security people. The developers want to say, okay, this version is working and I know how everything functions together and there's no problems. I want to keep it that way. And the security people always want to patch things. So different organizations are going to have different perspectives on how they're going to work. The IT mindset is to automate things, to use databases, to use templates and forms, to eliminate exceptions, to build something once and use it many times. But compare that to the marketing mindset. The marketing mindset is if you do the same thing twice, you haven't learned anything. And that leads to what I call the Wade rule. Wade is a systems developer that I worked with, and Wade would like to say, a computer is good at doing one thing a million times. Marketing wants to do a million things one time. And that kind of difference in perspective leads to conflicts. HR wants consistent policies implemented across the entire organization. Managers want flexibility. Editorial wants to believe that they're just being pure and dedicated to the truth, and sales wants money. So these different perspectives lead to conflicts. Different perspectives also lead to different expectations. For example, the HR department might be expected to be administrative experts, employee advocates, or business advocates, and you really need to make sure that's clear with your HR department. Is the HR department supposed to represent the employee to the business or the business to the employee? You can have very different expectations there. HR could be expected to be a business partner, or they could be expected to be a change agent. It's very rare that any particular HR manager, or for that matter, any given HR department, can be good at all of those things. Service departments like facilities or IT or customer service sometimes aren't even expected to have ideas by the other departments. They're just expected to implement things. So there's very different expectations. When someone comes to facilities, they just say, do this. They don't say, what do you think? The next issue is misaligned goals or incentives. Now, an interesting example of a problem here would be when you have some people who are commissioned and some people who aren't. So you have salespeople who want something done because it's going to affect their commission. And they're trying to get other people to do this for them who have nothing to do with that commission. And sometimes there can be resentment when somebody says, why am I doing this extra work so that you can make an extra buck? Another issue of misaligned goals or incentives, it's common for a sales manager to say something like, I need to light some fires under these people, get them motivated, get them moving. Well, that kind of motivation might work with salespeople, but it's probably not going to work with the IT guy who sits in the corner or the editorial guy who's an introvert and just wants to sit there with his head down. So you have different personalities and you have different ways that they go about their work. Another example would be if IT is measured on stability, or contrariwise, if they're punished for instability, then they're going to take a very conservative approach to things. The next reason that departments don't work well together is poor leadership. Leadership has to ensure that each department is aligned with the strategic objectives of the organization. And I have to stop for just a moment and say, you do have strategic objectives, right? Every organization should have strategic objectives that cut across all the departments, and every department has to be aligned along those strategic objectives. When that happens, when everyone has the same strategic objectives in common, it's a little easier to get common ground between the different groups. But another thing that leadership can do to mess up interdepartmental communication is when leadership promotes this attitude of, oh, that's marketing, they're that way. Oh, those are the systems people, they're always that way. You don't want to allow your leaders to promote or to encourage or to spread these bad attitudes towards other groups in the organization. Another thing is kind of weird. I call it inherited animosity. And that means when you come into a group, You don't know anything about systems or legal or HR or any of these different organizations. You just come in and now you're working with editorial or whatever it is. But you learn, you pick up from the other people in editorial who you're supposed to hate. It's a bad thing about people being social creatures. Is one way that we bond with one another is by being united in the group of people that we don't like. So different little groups will learn to have this inherited animosity. It's almost like in social media, where the only thing someone knows about someone else is that they're on the opposite side of a particular issue. They don't know anything about them as a person. They only know that they're on the opposite side of whatever it is they're talking about. So somewhat along the lines of inherited animosity is different parts of an organization may tend to encourage certain personality types, and certain personality types might tend to butt heads. So when you have a group that says, "Oh, those salespeople, they're always this way," when you have a group that's very like editorial, which they tend to be introverted, they tend to be focused on details, they tend to be very concerned about spelling and punctuation, and very nitpicky things, and they get very upset at people who are big picture and don't really care about all those kinds of details. So there are a lot of reasons why departments are going to have these kinds of misalignments that are going to cause them not to work well together. So to review really quickly, you need to realize that there are different perspectives. You need to be realistic about expectations and make sure that everyone in the organization is on the same page. And to do that, you need to align goals and incentives with the overall strategic goal, and make sure your leaders know their role in this, that they're both promoting the overall strategic objectives, but also not undermining things by spreading a bad report about other groups. And then you need to fight against inherited animosity. So one of the key principles I'm going to be talking about today is to put people before principles. Attitude and people skills are more important than any procedure. You need to get everybody on the same team. You need to make sure that they have the same focus, and having the right skills in interpersonal relationships is going to help you more than any. I'm going to talk about some procedures later on, but attitude is far more important. Now, I don't want to make this sound like the purple dinosaur, but we're all on the same team. You want to promote a team culture. You want to make people think that we're all aiming in the same direction. We're all going for the same end zone. We're all going for the same goalpost. Whatever it is, we have the same strategic objectives. We're all aiming for the same thing. And then trying to work across these cross-functional areas becomes a little bit easier. Now, the other thing that's very important here is to give workers some context. You don't want people to feel as if they're Sisyphus rolling a rock up a hill to let it roll back down again, that they're just doing this work and they don't understand why, and they don't see how it fits in to the overall objective, and they don't see how it fits in to the things that you're celebrating. A lot of people feel left out. Sales get celebrated when they cross some marker, or somebody gets an award and they say, "Oh, great, this team got an award for web design," or whatever it was. But people need to feel as if they have context in the work they do. And an interesting story about this is there were two bricklayers, and the two guys are working side by side, laying some brick. And one guy walks up to the first bricklayer and says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm laying a row of bricks." He walks up to the second guy and says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm building a cathedral." See, his mindset wasn't, "I'm just laying bricks." His mindset was, what I'm doing is part of a much bigger thing. And which guy do you think was more satisfied with his work when he went home that day? Now, it's also very important to insist on politeness in all interpersonal reactions or interactions between your staff. That includes in person, obviously, but it includes in email, it includes on the phone. And people need to learn to write emails as if anybody in the organization might read that email. It's very, very easy to be mean to someone in email, and sometimes to be mean and not even know it. It's kind of like when you're driving down the road. You're driving down the road and somebody cuts you off. It's easy to honk your horn and yell at them and use some choice language and be very angry at that person. But if that person pulls up next to you in the church parking lot, you're going to have a different attitude towards that person, right? So you need to fight against the problem of interpersonal relationships becoming dulled by distance through email. And you need to insist on an environment where you encourage people to get out of their chairs and to walk down the hall and talk to somebody. Because when you're talking to somebody face to face, you're far more likely to be polite than you're going to be over email. Also, there's a lot of communication that's lost through email. You lose tone of voice, you lose body language, you miss the smiles. It's so much better to speak with someone in person. So it's good to enforce a culture where people would rather get out of their chair or pick up the phone or say, hey, let's take 5 minutes and walk around the block, just get a breath of fresh air. Because getting people to interact with one another as human beings makes a really big difference. Now, this one is a little funny. Send your people to Vegas. I don't really specifically mean Vegas. But if you'll remember back during the financial crisis, President Obama was complaining about companies doing all these junkets to Vegas where they're spending a bunch of money. Well, the funny thing is Vegas is actually a fairly cheap location in terms of conferences. The hotels are cheap and the conference rooms are cheap. But the important thing here is it's important for your people to get to know each other outside of work, to be able to blow off some steam together, to be able to get to know each other as people. Now, the thing that's really important about this is that they do it cross-functionally and across departments. If you have just the editorial people going off and having a good time somewhere, all you're going to do is cement and dig that inherited animosity deeper, because you know what they're going to be talking about. They're going to be talking about how awful the salespeople are and how awful the systems people are and how awful the marketing people are. But if you send people to events or just cultural things, social things, take them to happy hour or whatever it is, you want the people to interact across departments and across functions so they get to know one another as people. Now, I'd like to tell you about a story about my friend Sergey. It's not really his name. Sergey worked in the fulfillment department of a publishing company, and everything had to be set up the right way in the fulfillment setup if we wanted something to work. If we wanted the money to come in, if we wanted to be attributed to the right marketing campaign, if we wanted to be attributed to the right account and go into the right thing for the accountants to be able to report on it, all these things had to be set up a particular way. And so Sergey was very insistent on certain rules. He wanted things to be done in a certain buttoned-down way, which was, of course, very appropriate for the kind of work that he did. But what happened was he became the blocker. He became the barrier. Whenever marketing wanted to do something new, which, as I was mentioning before, marketing typically wants to do something new very frequently, Sergey was the guy who got in the way and was trouble. And people would try to work with him, but it just didn't work out. So I got on a plane. I flew down to where Sergey lives. We had a casual dinner. We had some beers. We went fishing. We stayed up late at night fishing on the dock. And Sergey and I became friends. From then on, working with Sergey was so much easier. We'd get on the phone. It would be, hey, Sergey, how you doing? We were buddies. And being buddies made all the difference to the business. So the small amount of money that you save by not letting people go on trips or meet one another face to face or whatever it is penny wise and pound foolish. You want people to do things where they can do things cross-functionally. It has to be cross-functionally, cross departments, so they get to know each other, so they're not always at each other's throats. So to review, attitude and people skills are more important than processes. I'd rather have somebody with good people skills than somebody with lots of experience. You should promote an attitude of all being on the same team. It's kind of like a rifle company in the Civil War, all pointed in the same way. Make sure people know why they're doing the work they're doing. No Sisyphus complex. Create a polite workforce and workplace ethic. No raising voices, no shouting, no being mean. And then send people to Vegas. Now, the next trick is to realize that nobody is as bad as you think they are. You have to assume good intent. Now, I was working for a company where there was this guy, Joe, once again, that's not his name, where one department thought Joe was the problem. Everything they tried to do with this other department, they tried to do what Joe said, they tried to do what Joe suggested, and it just never worked out, and Joe was always getting in the way. Well, first of all, I would doubt that they did everything that Joe told them, but that's not really the point. I went to talk to Joe to find out what was going on, because there are very few people who go home at night and say, Hey, honey, guess how many people I screwed over today? Guess how many projects I blocked by insisting somebody use a stupid form? People don't do that. People want to feel good about their job. They want to do well. And if you assume that somebody is a troublemaker, then you're going to just perpetuate that animosity, and you don't want to do that. Yes, in some cases, somebody is a troublemaker. Rarely, in my experience, rarely. In that case, that's an HR issue. You need to get rid of that person. But most of the time, there's a misunderstanding. Most of the time, it's not that Joe doesn't want to do a good job. It's that other people are just assuming, and they're clashing, and they're having. So I went to Joe, sat down and spoke with him, and I wanted to get his side of it. And I listened to him and recognized the good points that he had. And Joe like melted in front of me. He couldn't believe that somebody was actually listening to him and trying to understand his point of view. He was so used to people being angry at him, saying that he was the problem, saying that everything was Joe's fault. Just the bare fact that I listened to him and heard his side made all the difference. Along those lines is you want to assume competent. Now, there are some incompetent people in the world, and when you find those people, once again, that becomes an HR matter. But generally speaking, people know their jobs. Generally speaking, people know what they're doing, they know what they should be doing, and they know how they should be doing it. That's why they have the job, and they've been doing it for a while. Now, in both these cases, good intent and competence, you might be wrong. But my point is, you're better off assuming good intent and assuming competence than the reverse. It's better to go in assuming that they want to do well and they can do well, and then be proved wrong, than to do it the other way around. It's far, far more effective. And then assume, as I said before, that people take pride in their work. People don't go home and say, look at the awful things that I did today. And people want to be on a winning team. They want to take pride in the work that they're doing. So all these things come down to getting the other side's perspective. Now, let's think about this in the context of a requirements document, because often what will happen is let's say someone in marketing will go to IT and say, can you build this? And IT will say, give me a requirements document. And what marketing is thinking is, come on, will you just build it? I've got this idea in my head. It's really clear in my head. It's pretty obvious if I just explain it to you. Can't you just build it? Why are you making me do all this work, right? And IT is thinking, these flaky marketing people think that I can read their minds, and that I can just build this thing without knowing what it's going to do, or what it has to interact with, or what it has to, what kind of reports do you want, all these other things. So there's a complete misalignment of expectations there. Now, the way to get past that is, instead of saying, well, first of all, let's talk about what's good and bad about a requirements document. First of all, people need to understand that a requirements document does not mean go away. A requirements document means I need to understand. I need to understand what it is you want. So people need to learn to communicate that on both sides of the coin. The IT people, when they say, I need a requirements document, it can't be done like, here's this barrier, here's this hoop I want you to jump through. It has to be done in the sense of, okay, but I need some clarification. And then the people who feel bad about having to write one need to understand that it's hard to do something without a requirements document. Now, a good way to get around this problem is to ask for help early in the process. If I go to IT and I say, hey, I have this idea. Can you help me think this through? They're going to be so much more receptive to that idea than if I come to them and say, I want you to build this by next Thursday. If I ask them for help, they're going to know things that I don't know. They're going to know system constraints. They're going to know, they might even have some ideas, things that they've been thinking about while they've been working on other projects. If you get their help early in the process, it will make things so much easier later. And as a matter of fact, you can say this the other way around. If you don't ask for their help early in the process, don't complain if they try to block you later, because they will. So, along with this, you want to align all projects and goals with your strategic objectives. Once again, you have strategic objectives, right? And every department should know what those strategic objectives are. So when you come along with a project and say, this project lines up with this strategic objective, therefore, there's some common ground already, because everybody's aiming for those strategic objectives. If you self-consciously align things that way, it makes it a whole lot easier to work across departments because everybody should be going towards those same strategic objectives. Now, I have this example. If I show that to you, you know exactly what that is. You look at that and you know it's a bicycle. But imagine taking that idea and taking that to an engineer and saying, can you build this? Well, of course not. For one thing, there's no spokes on the wheel, right? The thing that you happen to know is a chain because you know what a bicycle is. There's nothing in that diagram that tells you that's a chain. And what's this weird spaghetti stuff on the wheels? Are there really supposed to be those gaps in the wheels like that? And by turning that handlebar, what does that do when you turn that thing? You don't even know that you can turn it, right? So this is a very clear concept to someone who knows what a bicycle is. But there's no way that anyone could build something based on this. And this gets back, people need to understand that's the purpose of a requirements document. That's the purpose of getting the engineers in early. That's the purpose of doing this collaboratively so that people can work on both at the idea level, at the creative level, and also at the functional, practical level. So bring the engineers into the creative discussion. Now, engineers get the reputation for not being very creative, and whether that's true or false doesn't even matter, because if you bring them in early, then you're going to avoid so many pitfalls that you would have fallen into if you didn't get them involved early. And often, frankly, the engineers do have some really good ideas. All right, so you want to, okay, I'm sorry, I should have reviewed something. The review from the previous slide. First of all, help me think this through rather than build this. Second, bring in all the stakeholders early. And three, focus on the goal, not on minor details. So on this slide, build a culture of informed consent and ownership. I'm going to talk a little bit about the RACI matrix in a little bit. RACI is responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. It's a very good way to understand different people's roles for a different project. But you don't only want it as a worksheet, which I'll show you in a bit. You want it as an attitude. You want people to be self-consciously thinking whenever they're coming up with a new project or a new initiative or new something to do. They need to think, who needs to be consulted about this? Who needs to be informed? Who's accountable? Who's responsible? So let me give you an example on this. We're moving to Agile. Now, I was in an organization where the IT department decided that they were going to move to Agile, and it was, in their opinion, a response to a request from the rest of the organization that they felt as if IT was making business decisions without consulting the business side. In other words, IT was assigning priority to tasks without consulting with the other people, and everybody else wanted to be consulted. They want to be involved in that. So the IT folks were looking at Agile, and they realized that, well, that's really the role of a product owner. A product owner should have the roadmap and the product backlist and set the things for the Scrum and all that kind of stuff. So if we can just move into an Agile environment and move those product owners over into the business side, then that's responsive to that. Okay, well, that's all great as far as that goes. But there wasn't nearly enough consulting and informing about this because the business side didn't realize that they're going to have to hire a bunch of product owners, right? So the motivation for this move was entirely praiseworthy and very smart. But there really should have been a whole lot more discovery, a lot more consultation, and a lot more informing along the way so people understood what they were getting into. There was, in a sense, there was consensus and buy-in for this move, but nobody really understood what it was exactly that they were buying into. The next thing you want to do is memorialize agreements. In order to build a culture of informed consent and ownership, you need to write things down when you agree. Now, the purpose of this is not only for gotchas. Unfortunately, yes, sometimes it will be for gotchas. When someone says, I never agreed to that, and then you say, well, on January 5th, you did agree to that. Sometimes that's necessary, unfortunately. The real reason for memorializing agreements is it makes things, when you formalize things, it sticks a little better. People remember that. People are more committed to it. Now, I used to be in a publishing company where we had an interim CEO. And the CEO had a meeting every Monday where he had the heads of all the departments sit around a table. And he didn't really understand publishing as well as a lot of people in the room did. So he figured his role, he was just going to ask people what they were doing and how they're doing with that project. So he'd go around to each person, hey, Greg, last week you said you were working on this. How's that going? Nobody wanted to be the guy in that room who said, oh, I've done nothing on that in the last week. Having that formalized structure, having that accountability, having a situation where everybody knows what you're working on, there's transparency, there's openness, everybody knows what I'm working on, everybody knows my progress. That helps people to be motivated to get things done. Now, another way to memorialize agreements is a lot of times in a meeting, in a well-run meeting, at the end of the meeting, people say, okay, what are our takeaways? Who's responsible for what? And they'll assign tasks, right? Well, right there in that meeting, agree on the takeaways, agree on who's assigned to what, write it up in an email right there and then in the meeting. And at the end of the meeting, push send, everybody gets it. It's very clear. It's very clear what you've agreed to and who's responsible for what. And this is all so that you can be explicit about ownership. You want to make sure that people don't say, well, I don't know who was responsible for that. Everybody should know this particular job stops with Joe. Joe is responsible for this particular project, and that's part of what the RACI matrix is good for. It's also part of what memorializing agreements are good for. Be explicit. Be transparent about tasks and deadlines. This is one thing that's very helpful about the Agile framework, is that the tasks and the roadmap and what's in the Scrum and everything else should be visible to everyone. There shouldn't be any confusion about this. The stakeholders should talk with the product owner and figure out what it is we're going to work on. And then you have a roadmap that everybody understands. And then you have a product backlog, which everybody can see and everybody understands. And then the product owner puts these things into different discrete tasks to get done because he's prioritized them after speaking with the stakeholders, right? All this is about being transparent about tasks and deadlines so that everybody knows what's first and what's second. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about attitude because I personally think that interpersonal skills and attitude are far more important than any other kind of a form or a procedure or anything else you can do. However, forms and checklists are very useful, and I'll give you an example from my own life. I studied geology at the University of Maryland. I never took an editing class or a journalism class or a writing class. I couldn't type. And somehow or other, I got a job as an editor of a publication on natural gas transportation prices. Now, the reason I got this job, it wasn't particularly a writing job, was because it was mostly had to do with data, and I understood data just fine. But when it came to laying out pages and checking whether the right stuff was in the header or the footer, whether I had the right page different from the left page, whether I had the margins right on this page, whether I had the copyright date in the right place, all those kinds of things, I didn't know any of that. And the first couple of issues I put out for this publication were terrible because I didn't check them the way I should have. So I made myself a checklist. On every single page, is it a right or a left page? Is the page number in the right place? Does the header have the right information? Does the footer have the right information? You make that checklist and you follow it until it becomes second nature. Now, that was useful for me in quality assurance, but it was also useful in training. When I hired an editorial assistant to help me with this publication, I just gave her my checklist and said, for every page, go through this list. And that helped her to understand what had to be done to make sure that the publication was accurate and consistent. It's also useful in knowledge transfer. Now, I never got hit by a beer truck while I was in that job, fortunately, but there's this concept of a beer truck memo, which is if for some reason you are suddenly out, other people should know what to do in your absence. They should know who your main contacts are. They should know what systems you use. They should know what procedures, what checklists, what forms. All those things that are crucial to your job should be memorialized in something that I call a beer truck memo so that other people can pick things up where you left off if they have to. So, data for customer entry. This is another example where it's really important to see the other guy's point of view. Let's say you have a sales team that's out in the field and they're trying to get new customers for a retail business. But every new customer has to go through finance to get a credit check, and they have to fill out certain forms with finance, and then in order for them to be created in the system, uh, they need to first check and make sure that they're a new customer, not an old customer. So, for example, if someone says UVA, well, is that University of Virginia or not? Right? So once you see how the data is being entered, once somebody from the sales department goes and looks over somebody from customer service and says, oh, I see that that's what you're doing, then the whole concept of the uh, customer service department saying, we need the information in this format. Now they understand why. It's very important for people to be able to see that, to be able to see the other guy's perspective and point of view, so they understand why you need this form. Because most people, when they see a form, they just think, oh, come on, why do we have to do a form? Why can't you just do this? Well, usually there's a form because there's a very good reason why they can't just do this. So having people see how the data is entered is very helpful. They know, is it a new customer? Is there a discount? Who gets credit? Is there rush shipping? All those kinds of things. They need to understand why they're filling out all that kind of stuff. All right. Now, you also want to have, for any new project, a project charter. I'm going to give a sample of a project charter in a little bit. There are certain things that should go in the project charter to, once again, make things explicit. Who are the owners? Who are the stakeholders? What needs to be done? So there are lots of examples online of project charters, but generally speaking, this is what you want to have. An overview of the project, by which I mean the business case, how it aligns with strategic objectives, why you're doing it. In-scope and out-of-scope items are crucial for making sure that people understand how far this project goes and what it touches. You want to say, yes, we are absolutely talking about this database. No, we are absolutely not talking about this product over here. Milestones and deliverables are things that where you can measure the progress of the project as it proceeds. These are things that you have to deliver by a certain time, or these are things we can measure at certain times. Assumptions and constraints are things like, well, we assume that the project team is going to be available to meet once a week for an hour to review progress. Constraints might be things like, well, we're right in the middle of budget season, or we need to make sure we have buy-in from executives, or we need to be able to cut this agreement with a vendor, which we haven't been able to do yet. Costs are obvious. The RACI matrix is something we'll talk about more, but having a RACI matrix in a project charter makes a big difference because it's explicit about ownership. And then once again, in terms of being explicit, having project acceptance. In other words, this is the steering committee, this is the project owner, this is the project team. Every one of them signs the project charter. That kind of explicit agreement makes a big difference in getting people to take the task seriously. So then the next form and checklist that's useful is a RACI form. Now, RACI is responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. Responsible are the people who do the work. It might be more than one person. Several people can be jointly responsible, but there's only one person who's accountable. That's the person who has to sign off and approve it when it's done. And only one person should really be accountable. You could have levels of sign off. 3 people have to sign off, maybe, but one person is the final sign off, right? People who have to be consulted are people who have to give input. So let's say you're doing a project that's specifically about membership, but it tangentially affects subscriptions. Well, you need to make sure that the people who are involved in subscriptions know what's going on, because what you're doing is going to affect them. They need to be consulted. Other people simply need to be informed. They need to know what's going on. For example, maybe customer service needs to know, so that when someone calls up with a question and says, hey, are you guys aware that this is, oh yes, we actually have a project. We're working on that. We're trying to fix it. So some people need to be informed, communications or customer service or legal or somebody, but they don't necessarily need to be consulted. Now, a RACI matrix is interesting. And one thing that's interesting about it is that the roles may change in different parts of a project. So if you're writing an RFP, then one person might be consulted in the writing the RFP, but they might be responsible later on. Like, let's look at legal. Legal might be consulted when you write it. They might only be informed about bids and site visits, but they might be responsible for negotiating the contract and having final sign. Then the product owner would have final sign off, be accountable. So the benefit of having a matrix like this is in each step of the process, you're making it clear who's the owner, who's responsible, and who has to be consulted and informed. And that helps a whole lot in working across departments so that nobody gets left behind, so that finance can't say, hey, how come you didn't inform us? Or how come we weren't consulted? You have to make sure that you have that straight from the beginning as you put together the project. So look up the RACI matrix. It's a very good tool. Now, I say here meetings as work. What I really mean is meetings as productive work. Now, there are different types of meetings. Some meetings are informational. Some meetings are brainstorming. I don't like brainstorming personally. I think it's counterproductive. There are different types of meetings, but when you have a meeting, one way to try to make it more functional, I already mentioned how you should, at the end of the meeting, agree on the takeaways and who's responsible for what, and put that in an email at the end of the meeting. But another thing that's very useful is to build the documentation and requirements in the meeting. So ahead of the meeting, you provide an agenda. The reason for that is what I mentioned about brainstorming. There's this theory that, let's say you're working on a math problem and you've been working on it for an hour and you're just stuck. You can't get any further. Some people will say that a smart thing to do is to go work on a Sudoku for 15 minutes and then come back to the math problem. And the reason for that is that you're distracting your conscious mind. Sometimes your conscious mind is kind of in the way while your subconscious mind is working on a problem. That's why people sometimes will say you should sleep on something. It's getting the loud, obnoxious conscious guy out of the way so that the quiet, smart subconscious guy can work the problem. So the benefit of providing the agenda in advance is, provided everyone reads it, and there are ways you can try to get them to do that, provide the agenda in advance so that people, now they've got it in their head. They think about it. I like to go up to my direct reports and say, I'm going to give you an idea. I'm going to talk to you about it tomorrow, but I just want to give you the idea right now so you can think about it. I mention it to them, make sure they understand it, and then drop it. Then the next day I talk to them about it. Now they've had a full day for it to roll around in their brain, for them to come up with things that they might not have come up with spur of the moment in a brainstorming session. So you provide the agenda in advance, and after you provide the agenda, if there's anything that can be built in the meeting, do it right there. Have a screen in the meeting. Have somebody's laptop connected to that screen. Work on the requirements. Work on the RACI matrix. Work on the takeaways. Work on who's responsible. Build those things in the meeting itself so that the meeting itself becomes productive work. And then remember the point about bringing in the engineers. Bring in the engineers early so they're not going to block you later. The other thing to do in a meeting to make it successful is to make sure that you capture agreement and commitments and be boringly explicit about this. Joe, you understand this? You agree? Sam, you understand this? You agree? Lisa, you understand this? You agree? You're on board. Okay. Get agreement and commitments, memorialize them, write them down in an email during the meeting, send the email at the end of the meeting so that you've captured the agreement and commitment, you've memorialized it. Everybody knows, they know what they're responsible for, they know what they're accountable for. So, attitude trumps all this. Trying to get your people to have the right attitude, to be polite, to be friendly, to look at things across departments, to understand the other guy's point of view. All those soft skills are going to trump anything you can do about procedures or policy. And you really need to focus on that and work on that. And a very good way to work on that is cross-department friendships, by letting them, sponsoring a happy hour, whatever it is. Just make sure that the people mingle. You don't want to have little silos developing in your social engagements so that people just reinforce the inherited animosity. There has to be cross-pollination, so to speak. Make sure all departments are aligned with your strategic goals so that there's a common ground that everybody has to work towards. And that's the starting ground when you're coming up with a new project. Be explicit about agreements and ownership, and use helpful forms and procedures where they push explicit agreement and ownership. So that's my presentation. I would, of course, take questions during the presentation, and I would have a Q&A session afterwards.